Hello, and welcome to Grand Final History. In this episode, we go back to 1934, the 38th season of the VFL. Melburnians were celebrating the 100th anniversary of European settlement in 1934, promoting the image of Melbourne as the Garden City and the Queen City of the South, while also dealing with the challenges of the ongoing Depression. The celebrations made a hero of John Batman and ignored the dispossession of the original inhabitants of the land. There were many events and activities held between October 1934 and June 1935, some that are still with us today, such as the move of Captain Cook's parents' cottage from Yorkshire to Fitzroy Gardens, a small cottage that Captain Cook probably never saw, rebuilt in a part of Australia that he never actually visited, but you can still walk past it on your way from the city to a game at the MCG. Macpherson Robertson had made his fortune in confectionery and was one of the many wealthy individuals that donated funds to the Centenary celebrations. Two examples of his benevolence were the building of the Mac Robertson Girls High School, still in South Melbourne, and the Mac Robertson Centenary Air Race from Britain to Melbourne, one in a time of just under 3 days. A similar race, held 15 years earlier, took 28 days just to reach Darwin. Air travel was making great progress. Some footballers had even started catching planes to get to games. 1934 also saw the completion of the Shrine of Remembrance, which opened with huge crowds in a solemn ceremony on Remembrance Day. The memories of the First World War were still clear and present, while the remainder of the 1930s would see the world move towards yet another disastrous conflict. Many events during the year would have centenary versions, such as the Centenary Melbourne Cup, the Centenary Royal Melbourne Show, and the Centenary Art Exhibition. The VFL season would be known as the Centenary Premiership. 1934 also saw the Australian cricket team having a successful tour of England, regaining the Ashes 2-1 with radio broadcasts on the ABC, using creative synthetic broadcasts, combining telegrams and sound effects, combined with experience and intuition by a panel of commentators based in Sydney to convey their impressions of how each test in England was unfolding. In Australian politics, there was a federal election with Joseph Lyon's United Australia Party winning with a reduced majority. James Scullin stood down as the head of the Labor Party, and the new ALP leader was former Brunswick VFA half-forward flanker John Curtin. In other significant events during 1934, Mao Zedong and 100,000 soldiers commenced their long march north in China, while in Germany, Adolf Hitler combined the role of president and chancellor under the one title, Führer. As international politics headed into uncharted territory, the Australian government did its best to keep communists out. Egon Kisch was a Czechoslovakian activist, anti-fascist and communist, imprisoned in Nazi Germany before ending up in Paris. He travelled to Australia to end an anti-war conference held in Melbourne in November 1934. I don't think they got centenary endorsement for their event. The federal government declared him a prohibited immigrant and would not let him land in Fremantle. But in Melbourne, he was given an enthusiastic dockside welcome and literally jumped ship, breaking his leg. The authorities rushed him back on board, and as the ship sailed to Sydney, legal actions taken on his behalf saw the prohibited immigrant ruling declared invalid. The Immigration Department then sent an official to give the dreaded dictation test in any European language, a test that was built into the White Australia policy designed to keep non-whites out. Nevertheless, a sophisticated Czech like Egon could speak many European languages. What would the Immigration Department choose to trip up this undesirable, multilingual, radical communist? The immigration official read out the Lord's Prayer in Scottish Gaelic, a language regularly spoken by about 1 in 600 people in Scotland at the time. Egon failed the test and another legal challenge ensued. Embarrassingly for the federal government, the courts ruled that Scottish Gaelic was not a European language within the meaning of the Immigration Act. All this effort by the federal government had two main effects. Firstly, this charming, erudite, anti-war speaker and communist had been given a huge amount of free publicity, generating much bigger audiences when he gave his speeches, and secondly, fears had been raised that the Australian government was using the Immigration Act to curtail free speech, just as free speech was being curtailed by fascist and communist governments in Europe. Eventually, he was sent on his way in January 1935, and there have never been any further problems with Australia's immigration system and the actions taken by the Immigration Department. Newspapers in the 1930s often had stories about the English Football Association and which of those famous soccer clubs were winning in their season. But October saw a different type of story on English soccer that demonstrated the prevailing attitudes of the era. A shocking article, headline, "Wives Who Cannot Cook," described the terrible situation where professional footballers were eating nothing but fish and chips and tin foods because their wives had been working in factories and had not learned to cook before they married these poor men. An English league official was quoted as saying, "Girls should be prevented from marrying until they'd done cooking lessons and passed tests." Clubs were forced to send their players to eat at restaurants to ensure they were not undernourished. The Herald made no comment about whether local VFL players were at similar risk of undernourishment because of their wives' lack of cooking skills. Given women play professional soccer and footy in the modern era, is anyone testing the cooking skills of their partners? But let's focus on the VFL's 1934 season. Collingwood supporters were thrilled in February when news broke that Sid Coventry would be back for one more season. He had announced his retirement at the end of the 1933 season, but after some time off, he was ready to go once more and hoped to lead Collingwood to the Centenary Premiership. Players, umpires and supporters would have to adapt to the reintroduction of the flick pass for the season, where the ball could be flicked with an open hand rather than just punched. Early previews identified the challenge where a flick could look much like a throw. It would be something for the umpires to monitor. Recruitment of new players was often a point of contention. In 1934, the player in the spotlight was Alan LaFontaine, an outstanding university and amateur forward. Footscray were convinced he should be playing for them on residential basis, but instead it was Melbourne who signed him up, claiming the student was living at college at Melbourne University. There was a job lined up at the Vacuum Oil Company, a regular employer of Melbourne players, but it was a signing that would be a source of ongoing tension between Footscray and Melbourne. It won't be the last we hear of this star recruit. The bigger issue with recruitment was the ongoing migration of interstate players to Victoria. The Age reported that 34 interstate players played for league clubs in 1933, and if all pending clearances were approved, another 30 would be joining them. Employment, plus the £3 per game, was the magnet. The interstate clubs complained, and various league officials made comments about addressing trafficking of players for the good of the game, but they all wanted the best players for their own club as well. South Fremantle caught everybody by surprise when they demanded that Fitzroy and St Kilda pay £100 each for the clearance of William Bell and Bill Shenfield, respectively. The clubs refused, pointing out that this would contravene the Coulter Law. South Fremantle probably considered that they had to look after themselves as they saw their players moving east. Another perspective on the issue of clearances and freedom of choice for players to move clubs in search of a better deal was discussed in the Herald in April, addressing issues that would finally come to a head 50 years later in 1983, when Silvio Ficini took the league to court to switch from South Melbourne to St Kilda. The article in 1934 headlined, "Indented Labour in the Football Game." It said the restriction on the right of footballers to gain the highest rewards for their ability appears to many to be an official form of tyranny. It would be decades before the clearance system would break as a result of legal challenge, but some could mount the argument way back in the 1930s. One of the recurring themes of league football is high-profile players getting into trouble with the law when driving, whether it be driving when intoxicated, being involved in a bingle, getting a speeding ticket, or even driving when disqualified for earlier offences. It seems to happen every year. It was even happening way back in 1934, when reigning Premiership captain-coach James Bissett was fined £2 and £1 costs when he did not stop to swap names and render assistance after hitting a cyclist. Bissett allegedly said, "Why don't you look where you're going?" and drove off. He told the court he did not regard the accident as serious enough to report. The boy was not hurt, and there appeared not to have been any damage. One key difference to modern times was that the story was covered in just 2 paragraphs on page 4 of the Herald, rather than the front page, the back page, and multiple other pages. Maybe this season there'll be no modern players causing incidents with their driving. Now that we've mentioned South Melbourne's coach, let's have a look at the coaching changes in 1934. 5 of the 12 clubs had new coaches, which was about average for this era. Many clubs turned over coaches every season or two in search of success, but not Collingwood. Jock McHale had been appointed in 1912 and was up to season 23, and he had plenty more to come. At Essendon, their playing coach, Garnet Campbell, had transferred to Sandringham in the VFA, so Charlie May was promoted from seconds coach to the senior role in a non-playing capacity. Charlie had played in the VFA for a couple of seasons before joining Essendon in 1922 and played in the back-to-back premierships of 1923 and 24. Perhaps he could bring back some of the success to a team that had been absent from the finals. Fitzroy decided that they needed a playing coach to lead their team on the field, so Frank Marr's time was up, despite the Maroons having had their best season in many years. Jack Cashman returned from 3 years in Perth, where he had led West Perth to a premiership and 3rd place. But his time at Fitzroy would be short and unhappy. Richmond had made the grand final in 1933 with first-year coach Billy Schmidt, but 1934 found Billy back at Warwick Nabil and captain Percy Bentley taking over as captain coach. Perhaps, according to some, to ensure that Bentley stayed at the club rather than taking a coaching role elsewhere. The Saints had welcomed their prodigal son, Colin Watson, back to the club in 1933. He had won the Brownlow in 1925 as a 25-year-old, at the top of his game, one of the best players in the league, but then shocked everybody when he left St Kilda to play for Stawell. St Kilda refused to clear him, and things went from bad to worse when, after spending a year out of the game, he took over as Maryborough captain coach, and the Ballarat League, perhaps thinking of the large gates at each game that he appeared, allowed him to play without a clearance. The VFL was incensed, and the entire Ballarat Football League was disqualified. Watson resigned before the 1928 season. He took up professional running before returning to the game in 1930 for the Western District, and then finally, as a 32-year-old, returned to St Kilda in 1933 and was appointed coach at the start of 1934. Quite the journey. Hawthorn's coach had also taken a roundabout journey to return to the VFL. Bill Toomey Sr. made his playing debut with Collingwood in 1918 and quickly made an impression. Quick was the operative word with Bill. Despite his on-field success, built around his speed, he wanted to win the Stawell gift. So in 1923, he left the VFL, moved to Stawell, and won the gift in 1924, along with many other professional races. He kept playing and coaching country football alongside his running career before taking over the Hawthorn job as a non-playing coach in 1934. He'd been a premiership player in 1919. Could he be the one to bring success to Glenferrie Oval? The previews before the season contained all the usual excitement of the return of footy, with the added enhancement of the Centenary season to make 1934 even more special. League Secretary Leek McBrien wrote in the Sporting Globe before the opening round, declaring, "Our football is the only national winter game in Australia." It had been a wet and cold pre-season, adding a degree of difficulty for those new players looking to break into a league club. But perhaps it was just as well to show their style in the conditions of the winter game. The Herald reported that over 600 players that had attended the initial training nights across the 12 clubs had been sent home. Only about 35 new players were expected to debut, and most of those with the weaker clubs. Previews of the opening round forecast big crowds, and The Sun had a front-page spread showing each of the 12 captains in their normal day jobs. Clubs and supporters were all confident of success in the Centenary Premiership, at least until round 1 was done. A record 131,000 people went to the 6 games of the opening round. The match of the day was expected to be at the Lakeside Oval, where 40,000 people saw South Melbourne unfurl their Premiership flag in front of the visiting Collingwood. The Magpies were used to this type of ceremony, but usually conducted at their home ground, where they had the honour. This was South Melbourne's day, with an easy 35-point win to start their Premiership defence. Bob Pratt scored 8 goals. Get used to hearing his name, for this would be a remarkable season for the Swans full forward. There was only one close game, with Fitzroy getting home by 2 goals against North. Otherwise, it was big wins for Carlton over Hawthorn, Essendon too good for Footscray, Geelong over St Kilda, and Richmond much too strong for Melbourne. Fitzroy lost to Footscray in round 2, and things got a bit heated at the Maroons. When captain coach Jack Cashman went onto the field on Tuesday evening to lead training, there were boos from the spectators. There had already been a number of letters from anonymous supporters wanting to see him gone. By Wednesday, Cashman announced his resignation. Despite his career at the club from 1926 to 31, his premiership success in Western Australia, Cashman was so disappointed he resigned as coach, as captain, and from the playing list altogether. Cashman would be cleared to Carlton, where he played for the rest of the season and into 1935. One of the few players to have captain-coach one team and played for another in the same season. Len Wigraft, a former Best and Fairest winner, took over as non-playing coach. In round 3, South Melbourne's Bob Pratt kicked 15 goals against Essendon. At one stage, he kicked 8 goals in 10 minutes, which must have been extraordinary to watch, unless you barracked for Essendon. Round 5 was a King's Birthday split round, and on the Monday, Geelong hosted Collingwood for a draw, when the Cats' Lou Daly scored a point with the very last kick of the day. But, more notable perhaps, was Gordon Coventry kicking his 1,000th goal. While no one jumped the fence, nor swarmed onto the ground, Geelong had planned for the occasion, and presented both Gordon and Sid with plaid travelling rugs made in Geelong with their initials in black and white. The Mayor of Geelong also presented the brothers silver cigarette cases with the Geelong crest. Perhaps not the gift you would give in the modern era, but a way of noting Gordon's milestone and the fine careers of both players. After the game, on the topic of reaching 1,000 goals, Gordon Coventry said in his own understated manner, "Well, I don't feel any different, but it's a grand thing to have done it." Round 6 meant that the season was 1/3 of the way through. Richmond were on top of the ladder with 5 wins, closely followed by Collingwood, back in familiar territory after a disappointing 1933, and South were 3rd, just ahead of St Kilda on percentage, while Carlton was 5th. Those 3 clubs had 4 wins under their belt. There were fears that the season was beginning to become lopsided, with the same weaker teams of recent seasons unable to challenge the top clubs. But at least St Kilda, under returning hero Colin Watson, were giving their supporters some hope. Watson was playing so well, he'd been selected for the interstate team. Fitzroy had already lost their coach, and Footscray would sack Bill Cubbins after not selecting him to play in round 6. He told his players that he had been, quote, stabbed in the back by a lot of squealers, and he would not address them again. Albert Morrison took over as captain coach for the remainder of the season. Cummins' 20-year playing career at St Kilda and Footscray was over. The teams took a break after round 6 for the interstate game against South Australia in Adelaide, and a second Victorian team would take on the VFA in a charity fundraiser at the MCG. There had been an interesting proposition down in Geelong, where the second A team, undefeated in 6 games, had challenged the senior Geelong team. The league did not give permission for the challenge to proceed. They did not want a distraction from the charity game against the VFA. 30,000 people were at the MCG to see the VFL defeat the VFA 21 goals 17, 143 to 17 goals 8, 110. While over in Adelaide, the main topic of conversation was the omission of Colin Watson from the 18 selected to take the field against the South Australians. He was named as 19th man. Some thought it might have been a hangover from the time Watson played without a clearance, but surely not. South Australia won the game, 21 goals 15, 141, to the Vics on 18 goals 22, 130. St Kilda officials were more upset by Watson's omission than the result of the game, declaring that it was an insult to Watson, an insult to St Kilda, and an insult to the Victorian team. In round 8, Fitzroy travelled to the Lakeside Oval for their clash against the Swans, and while South won to keep in touch with the top 4, the 9-point win was closer than it should have been. South Melbourne's fullback, Ron Hellis, had injured his groin and asked Laurie Nash to kick out after a behind, so no South Melbourne players dropped back to defend their goal. Fitzroy's Colin Benham, a hard-working ruckman, took the mark and had a shot after the bell. His kick was wide and heading for a behind, until it bounced off one of the young boys who had run onto the ground to celebrate the South win. The ball then went through the goals. No player from either team had actually touched it, so the goal umpire signalled a goal. It did not change the result, but the final gap between the sides was reduced and South had a slightly lower percentage because of their lack of concentration. Colin Benham had one of the most unusual goals scored in league history. Round 10 also saw the end of North Melbourne's playing coach Dick Taylor. He'd been coach since 1932. 6 wins in his first season were followed by 7 in the second, but North had not won a game in their 10 rounds so far. In the modern era, mid-season resignations are somewhat stage-managed affairs, with statements such as, "for the good of the club," and other PR-managed quotes. Things were a bit more raw in 1934. After North had lost to 11th-placed Hawthorn, Taylor made his feelings known to the press. He said, quote, "I am disgusted with the team and there is nothing else for me to do but resign. What's the use of battling your heart out for a team like that? I think the reason why certain of our players did not show up today was, well, they could not do better." End quote. Surprisingly, he did say he was willing to continue as non-playing coach, but the club let him go, and former Essendon and Geelong Premiership player Tom Fitzmaurice took over for the remainder of what would be a tough season. The real controversy of round 10 was the game between Collingwood and Carlton, which saw some of the most brutal and unattractive aspects of the game. It was the most contentious game of the season and would still generate arguments about who did what and who was at fault for years to come. Rumours had circulated before the game that some players were marked men. From the start of the game, it was obvious that there was more spite and niggle than usual, even between these two bitter rivals. It only got worse as the game went on. Veteran umpire Bob Scott, so well regarded he'd been chosen for the last 5 grand finals, had his hands full trying to manage the game. He stopped play twice in an attempt to cool bitter spirits. But things got nasty again at the end of the second quarter. The halftime bell provided the break that stopped the situation getting out of control. In the third quarter, Collingwood's veteran skipper, Sid Coventry, gave Gordon Mackey a whack on the neck. Mackey's response was instant and brutal, punching Coventry until he was knocked out, battering his face, and giving him a fractured skull. All players converged to the incident. Gordon Coventry, normally a mild and quiet player, ran from one end of the ground to the other to take on Mackie. It was an all-in brawl that could have easily incited the crowd, though it was reported later that many of the players were doing their best to separate combatants rather than land more blows. Umpire Scott, the 2 boundary umpires, and 1 goal umpire tried to calm things down, but it was only with the help of police that the players separated. Scott again held up play for 2 minutes as players returned to their positions. Despite all the incidents, only 3 Carlton players were reported: Mackie, Henry Maskell, and Maury Mocker Johnson. Many thought other names should have gone into the umpire's report, and Carlton were incensed that only their players faced penalties. In 1936, Bob Scott provided his perspective in an article in the Sporting Globe, noting that what an umpire saw on the field often differed from what those on the other side of the pickets perceived. Sid Coventry was taken off the ground, battered and concussed. He would be out of the game for a month as he recovered. Despite Carlton's call for further action, and the calls from all the newspapers for something to be done to address the situation, the only consequences were suspensions for Harry Maskell and the Blues captain Maury Johnson. The umpires committee announced that the 2 boundary umpires and 1 goal umpire had been suspended until the end of the season for their poor performance and neglect of duty. Another brawl, another call for action, and yet more umpires were suspended than players. It was a tough time to play football. At the end of July, the season was 2/3 complete, and the lopsided nature of the competition was clear. The 5 teams who had been regular finals participants in recent seasons were again battling out for the top 4, while the remaining 7 clubs were well out of contention yet again. Geelong and Collingwood had the top 2 spots on 9 wins and a draw, while South, Carlton and Richmond were all on 9 wins, separated by percentage. Richmond had a surprise loss to Melbourne in round 12 and dropped from 2nd to 5th. There were calls for pooling of gate receipts and equalising of revenue, as well as restrictions on how the top teams recruited to help even the competition. Nothing would come of these, and so the bottom teams had a very hard time getting enough wins to attract more members and attendance, which would improve their financial position, which would allow them to recruit better players, which would improve their winning chances and allow the positive cycle to continue. There was also a call in the Sporting Globe for an independent board of management for the league, recognising the inconsistency of club delegates who were primarily interested in the performance and benefits accruing to their individual club, trying to cooperate with other delegates that were also trying to promote the interests of their own club. It would be another 5 decades and several expensive consultants' reports before an independent commission was implemented. While Carlton and South may have been level on points, their round 13 game showed how wide the gap between the 2 teams could be. Up to half-time, the Blues had been slightly in front, leading by 8 points at the long break. But then the game changed, as the Swans put on an exhibition, kicking 13 goals to behinds in the 3rd quarter. The Age called it the most delightful play ever given by a Southern combination. During the flood, Pratt scored his 100th goal for the season in just round 13. There was applause from all the spectators and handshakes from teammates and opponents alike. But still, no spectators jumping the fence. The 21-year-old Pratt was having a goal-kicking season like no other, and finished this game with another 11. Jack Worrell described Pratt as a freak footballer, and one apparently made out of whalebone. He can twist in the air at all angles, frequently marking the ball when out of position. And he can kick either foot in any position, whether on the run or standing still. Away from football, one of the most influential men of the league had to endure one of the most challenging times of his life. A few days after Collingwood beat Essendon in round 13, Jock McHale's 17-year-old daughter, Jean, died. She had been ill for 2 months before having a sudden heart failure while in hospital. Despite his highly public role as coach of the most successful team in the VFL, the McHale family were very private, and not much was said in public, other than the funeral notice. McHale was able to take some time to grieve, as the following week was a bye for the interstate game against South Australia. From then on, Jock would only ever wear a black tie as a mark of remembrance for his daughter. Whether in the 1930s or in the modern era, we focus on the performance of players and coaches, but they all have their personal lives and personal challenges that are much more important than the game. Back to the footy now. The interstate game was both an opportunity for the Victorian team to avenge its unexpected defeat by South Australia earlier in the season, and it also became the platform for one of the greatest feats of skill, performance, and showmanship ever seen on the MCG. Bob Pratt was ill and unable to play, so Laurie Nash was selected. He played the first quarter at centre-half forward and picked up 2 goals, and then moved to full forward in the second quarter, when the Saints' Bill Moore went off the ground injured. Nash put on a masterclass. 7 goals in the third quarter, 6 in the last. 18 goals in total in an unforgettable display of forward brilliance. The Victorians had an easy win, and Pratt had provided something for everybody to talk about. Earlier in this episode, we noted an example of the perennial issue of league players getting into trouble with their driving. Poor behaviour on football club trips is also a recurring theme, no matter the era. Hawthorn players may not have been making much impact on the field, but during the bye week for the interstate game, the club had gone to the country to play an exhibition match in Junee, New South Wales. After the game, some of the players got back late to their hotel, broke in, and thought putting teammates into a bath would be fun. The arrival of local police, eviction from the hotel, and a £30 damages bill would have taken some of the humour away for all involved. But players never misbehave in the modern era, so this type of incident will never happen again. As the season drew to a close, the imbalance of the competition was generating more discussion. One option entering the mix was a potential Final 5, to be played after a modified home and away season. The man behind the proposal was Kenneth McIntyre, the young mathematician who had developed the Final 4 system the league adopted in 1931. It would not happen yet, but eventually, in another 40 years, when the VFL had their own ground to stage finals, the Final 5 would be implemented, with 2 games played each of the first 2 weeks of the final series. A good idea, but too soon in 1934. While the league was worried about an uneven competition, the VFA was in a desperate state, and there were real fears it would fold. Crowd numbers were down, clubs could not cover costs, and the association sent a desperate letter to the VFL, proposing a merger with a new board of control to establish a competition for all 24 clubs. There was also the implied threat that the VFA grounds could be used for some other winter code in the next season. Picking up on a threat/idea floated in 1933 by the VFA president J.J. Liston that association clubs could switch to either soccer or one of the rugby codes. Reports in the following days suggested that the league did not take this threat seriously and instead proposed that the association would be better focused on getting their own house in order and perhaps reducing the number of their clubs. In the modern era, the Brownlow medal count is the night of nights for the league, with red carpet fashions and more. But in 1934, it was the annual league ball, in its 3rd year and the biggest one ever. Fitzroy alone had 100 people attending, and other clubs had similar numbers. Dancing was from 8:30 until 2 a.m, with cars provided travelling to every suburb for no more than 2 shillings. It was a glamorous affair, and the Table Talk weekly paper provided detailed descriptions of the many gowns and dresses worn on the evening. But I'll leave that for you to follow up if you're interested. With 2 weeks to go, the top 4 was locked in, but which club would finish where was still very open. Geelong was on top, 2 points clear of South Melbourne and Richmond, and Collingwood was 4th. The blockbuster game in round 17 was Richmond hosting South. Whoever won was in line for the double chance and perhaps top spot. It was close all day, with the Tigers holding on by 1 goal. Geelong won easily as expected against Essendon, while Collingwood won after a strong fight from old rivals Fitzroy. The next Saturday was cold. The rain bucketed down and grounds were covered in water and mud. Richmond and Collingwood had easy wins, but the big clash was South hosting Geelong, and the Swans bounced back with a big win against the Cats, propelling Richmond to top of the ladder. Geelong dropped to second, the Swans were third, and Collingwood were back in the finals, 2 points behind South. Carlton picked up the Almostus Award for finishing fifth just outside the finals. They had that spot locked in since round 13. At the other end of the ladder, it had been a miserable season yet again for North. They had not won a game and collected another wooden spoon. They had lost 4 games by less than a goal, and in a year of high scores, they had a record first quarter against Melbourne when they kicked 10 goals to 62, but only 5 goals and 12 behinds for the rest of the game, to lose by 2 points. They would do better in the next Centenary Premiership season, but 1934 was a tough time for the boys from Arden Street. A measure of how unbalanced the season was could be seen in the fact that the top 5 sides across 18 rounds of football only lost 3 games to the bottom 7 teams. But the home and away season was over, and now it was finals time. The Wednesday night before the finals started, the umpire committee met to count the Brownlow medal votes. The winner was a young Dick Reynolds, in just his second season with Essendon, defeating dual Brownlow medalist Hayden Bunton by 1 vote. The last 3 seasons had seen the Brownlow won by a first-year and then a second-year player in Bunton, and now another second-year player had won. The veterans of the game may have been wondering what the umpires were up to. Essendon's delegate to the league had the happy task of travelling to the club's annual ball and announcing the good news. Bunton was the first to send a congratulatory telegram. Next morning, Dick Reynolds was back at work at the William Peat Boot Factory in Collingwood when the Herald's reporter caught up with him. Reynolds expressed delight and surprise at the honour. Since his debut at the start of the 1933 season, he played 31 of a possible 33 games, and despite missing 2 matches this season, he still managed to poll the most votes. A Brownlow medalist at the age of 19. As they reviewed the count, the press asked how it was that key forwards like Pratt and Coventry could not get more recognition from the umpires. Some are still asking that same question today. The first semi-final was between Collingwood and South on Saturday the 22nd of September. Collingwood supporters were thrilled to have Jack Regan returning to the fullback spot after missing a week due to injuries received in a car crash. Also returning to the team were the Collier brothers, Albert and Harry. All 3 are members of the Collingwood Team of the Century, so you can imagine the value they would add to a side aiming to defeat the reigning premiers. South were without Pratt, who had been suspended towards the end of the season and had 1 week to go. Austin Robinson was also out with an injured knee, but Brighton Dickens was back, and there was a handy bloke called Bob Pratt at full forward. The Friday Night Herald preview had South as slight favourites, but noted Collingwood had their best team in for the season. The expert panel of current and former players and officials clearly favoured South. 52,000 spectators saw the Magpies get off to a good start, picking up a 4-goal lead by the end of the first quarter, but the Swans regained their composure in the second quarter, kicking 4 goals, and at half-time, Collingwood had just a 4-point lead. It was anybody's game. Collingwood were the stronger team across the field in the vital third quarter, but there was one significant problem. Instead of kicking goals, they insisted on scoring behinds. 10 scoring shots for 10 behinds. South only had 4 shots at goal, but 2 goals and 2 behinds meant they outscored the Pies, despite all their efforts. The teams started the fourth quarter level. Only one could proceed. The loser would be ending their season, and both sides were obviously desperate for the win. Collingwood finally managed to score a goal and broke the sequence of behinds. They got a break on the Swans, but it was South, winning the game with the last 3 goals of the match. the last coming when a Collingwood player slipped, allowing Pratt to pick up the loose ball and kick the winning goal, the decider that ended the Magpies' year. In a moment that summed up Collingwood's game, they did have an opportunity to retake the lead in the final seconds, but the vital kick went out of bounds. Perhaps Collingwood were unlucky to lose, but bad kicking is bad football. South had managed to make it to the preliminary final with a 3-point win. Collingwood, 9 goals 21-75, was too wasteful against South's 11 goals 12-78. Gordon Coventry said after the game he could not explain the cause of his inaccuracy. He was so disappointed he went to bed at 7 p.m. on Saturday night. He could only recall one similar experience, also in a semi-final, against Geelong in 1925, but he hoped he would never repeat the experience. The loss meant the end for Sid Coventry's illustrious career. He might have been a St Kilda player, having signed with them as a youngster back in Diamond Creek, but a year in Tasmania and another one out of football left him clear to join his younger brother at Collingwood way back in 1922. He was appointed captain in a shock decision at the start of the 1927 season. A Brownlow medal, a Copeland medal, and a Premiership in a standout season validated that decision. Sid said his biggest thrill was leading Collingwood to an unmatched 4th Premiership in a row in 1930, when a stunning comeback in the third quarter blew Geelong away, all while coach Jock McHale was in his sickbed at home. In his 8 years as captain, the Magpies only missed the finals once, a fine career from an impressive leader who would go on to serve his club as president when they were facing another crisis. But that is a story for another episode. Next up was the second semi-final between top-of-the-table Richmond and second-place Geelong. The Tigers' punt road home was being reclaimed by the cricket club, the centre wicket area roped off for top dressing. So Tuesday training was at the Motordrome, Richmond willing to pay the ground hire fee to train on an entire football field. Hard to imagine cricketers pushing footballers off the oval when training for finals in the modern era, but that was life in the 1930s and for many years to come. The clubs had only met once this season, with the Cats having a win at home, but the Tigers had done enough to finish on top of the ladder. The clubs had also clashed in the 1933 preliminary final, a thrilling game won in the final quarter by Richmond. This was a game anticipated by many, but few were willing to predict the outcome in the press previews. The Friday Herald's expert panel was evenly split between the two sides, with many of the players or club officials settling for a 50-50 call, saying either team could win. There had been some warm days in September 1934, but the second semi-final day was cold and wet. So wet that many sporting events, including the VFA Grand Final, were postponed or cancelled. But the VFL went ahead with the semi-final. Only 35,000 sturdy souls braved the elements, hoping for another classic final between these two rivals. The league might have been disappointed with the attendance, the lowest since 1927, but delighted that their rain insurance investment paid off. Geelong supporters might have been hopeful of a close game given all of the previews of the match in the press, but once again the Cats failed in a semi-final. Prior to this season, Geelong had played in 12 semi-finals, but only won 2. 1934 would not help this record. Richmond showed stronger defence and adapted better to the wet conditions, other than for one amazing 4-minute burst in the second quarter, where Geelong kicked 4 goals and only trailed by 3 points. It was Richmond's game. When the bell sounded for half-time, Richmond were up by 6 points, and people may have discussed how the predicted close game was unfolding. But the second half was one-way traffic. Maybe Geelong was put off by Richmond's unusual appearance. As described in The Age, they had removed their wet jumpers and appeared dry and warm in their scratch uniforms. Basil McCormick donned an emerald green sweater set off with squares of white. Jack Titus had patches of reddish-brown, and others displayed all manner of hues and tints. One Geelong official described Richmond as more like a flock of rosellas than a side of footballers. The coloured jumpers were worn under the normal sleeveless Richmond jumper, but it still would have been an odd sight. Despite the poor conditions, the Tigers scored 14 goals to Geelong's 2. It was another long ride back to Corio on the train for the Cats. They could regroup for the preliminary final, while the Tigers could rest up for the Centenary Grand Final in their Jubilee year. Richmond 19 goals 20, 134 to Geelong 7-8-50. The preliminary final had captured the imaginations of football supporters far and wide. Two clubs had travelled all the way from Kalgoorlie. They timed their holiday for the preliminary and grand final as part of the big trip east. It would be the third match between the two well-performed teams. Geelong had beaten South at Corio in June, but South won the last match of the season, in the rain and the mud, by 42 points, giving them the confidence that they would be going through to the grand final. Geelong were hoping they might see a repeat of 1925, where they lost the semi-final, but used their right of challenge to win the Premiership. It was a different final system now, but they still had a chance. South would lose Brighton Diggins after the semi-final, but got Laurie Nash back in after his suspension. And with the Swans showing more skill and determination, it was another one-sided game after a close first half. The weather was again poor, the ground was already wet, and the showers during the afternoon meant a greasy ball and slippery conditions for the players. Only 34,000 brave spectators ventured out into the wet and cold day, and just as they had done in the final home and away game of the season in the wet, the Swans were more at home than the Cats. The gap at the big break was just a couple of goals, but after half-time, Geelong seemed to be spectators rather than participants, while South Melbourne played some brilliant football. It was not what the Geelong players or supporters wanted to see. Geelong kicked 3 goals in the second half to South Melbourne's 9, and it would have been many more if they'd kicked straight. The final scores were South Melbourne 15 goals 18, 108, to a disappointing Geelong 7 goals 6, 48. Pratt scored 6 goals to bring him within sight of an extraordinary 150 target, and Nash showed no ill effects of the 4-week break, kicking 4 goals. Richmond would be going into their 4th grand final in a row, the last 3 with 3 different coaches, setting a unique league record. This year it was Percy Bentley in his first year as captain coach in his 10th year at the club. The strong, mobile ruckman had been captain since 1932, winning the Premiership that season under Checker Hughes, and then runner-up to South Melbourne under Billy Schmidt. He'd been a player under dual Premiership coach Dan Minogue and Mel Morris, providing a range of styles that he would adapt into his own as leader of the Tigers. He would continue to guide the Tigers until 1940 when he retired as a player and became non-playing coach at Carlton, leading the Blues to 2 premierships and then becoming a long-standing committee member. But that's all in the future. Percy Bentley was confident of success in 1934, telling The Age, "We've had special training to fit us for the late finish to the season, and we are certain to be well in it at the finish." South Melbourne's captain coach, Jack Bissett, was a former Richmond ruckman and former teammate of Percy Bentley. He was in the 2nd year of his tenure as captain coach, having won the Premiership, beating the Tigers, in his first season in charge. In the weeks and months after that grand final, he made it clear how pleased he'd been to knock Richmond off in the 1933 decider. He felt that he'd been unfairly blamed for the Tigers' loss in the 1931 grand final against Geelong, and was happy to leave, especially as he was also able to get a full-time job with Crofts Grocery Store, run by South Melbourne's businessman president, Charlie Crofts. Umpire Jack McMurray Sr. might have been in the running for the 1934 grand final after a well-noted first semi-final effort, but he injured his foot working at the Dunlop Rubber Company in Port Melbourne. An oil drum had dropped onto his foot, breaking his big toe. Steel-capped safety boots were not yet a thing in 1934. The umpire would once again be Bob Scott for his 6th grand final in a row. Despite the outrage at the round 10 battle between Collingwood and Carlton and the subsequent investigation of umpires, Scott clearly had the confidence of the umpires panel to once again take on the biggest game of the season. In the papers, predictions were evenly divided, but The Age had no doubt the Centenary pennant was, quote, regarded by everyone as the most coveted prize ever offered in the history of sport in Victoria, unquote. There had been more rain in the week before the game, but the VFL had done their bit to keep the MCG service in good nick by successfully arranging the cancellation of a mass rehearsal for the school children who were preparing to put on a Centenary display the next Friday for the Duke of Gloucester. South Melbourne made 2 changes for their team, bringing back stars Brighton Dickens and Terry Brain, both veterans of the 1933 Premiership. Wilbur Harris moved to 19th man, and Alan Welsh, after playing every game of the season, missed the grand final. While the change may have happened anyway, an injury to Welsh made sure that he would miss. He would be back next season and played with South until 1937. Richmond, with a week off after the second semi, took in an unchanged team. The sides had played twice this year, and Richmond had won both. The first game at South was an easy win by Richmond. Then, at Punt Road, the Tigers had several players out and trailed at half-time, but showed their team strength by coming from behind to win by a goal. But now, South had their Laurie Nash and Brighton Dickens back, and the side had dominated against Geelong in the preliminary final. The Friday Night Herald expert panel of current league players favoured the Tigers 9 votes to 6, with several comments that the Richmond backline would be too strong for South. The keystone to the Tigers backline was the full back line of Martin Bolger, Maury Sheehan and Kevin O'Neill, known in the press and to supporters as the Three Musketeers. But opposing them was Bob Pratt at full forward, having a season like no other, already on 148 goals, eclipsing all league records of the time. In one game against the Magpies, Collingwood's fullback Jack Regan, claimed by some, including Pratt, as the best fullback ever, was taken off Pratt. As they passed each other to take up their positions, Regan asked Pratt how many goals he'd kicked. About 9, was the answer. Regan shook his head, disgusted. If you heard Jock McHale during the break, you'd think it was 19. Bob Pratt was interviewed in 1995 in an article published in the Footy Almanac, and even in his 80s, he could still show the body positioning and the moves he made his own on the ground, though the unrivalled leap had long gone. Pratt made it clear, despite the reports of tension between he and Nash, that the two very different personalities always got on. He also pointed out that his 150 goals in 1934 came from just 21 games, whereas Peter Hudson, who also kicked 150 goals in 1971, had 24 games. But perhaps the best summary came from his beloved wife, Olive, who, in a brilliant summary, said, "Well, I can only say this. He led like Dunstall. He marked like Ablett. He kicked like Lockett. And best of all, he looked like Modra." Pratt's lead up to the grand final was disturbing. During grand final week, he was offered a £100 bribe to play dead, the equivalent of 2 seasons of match payments. He reported it to Archie Cross, who told him not to tell his teammates. Not the ideal preparation for the big game. 65,000 people were at the MCG, 10,000 down on the previous year, which may have been due to the fear of more rain, or perhaps some people were tired of the squeeze in the ground that was not yet built for this sort of crowd. In the curtain raiser, Melbourne won yet another second 18 premiership, this time defeating Geelong. Melbourne 8 goals 13-60 to Geelong's 8 goals 5-53. It was Melbourne's 4th successive reserves premiership. They might be developing some foundations there. We'll see in the future episodes. The 1934 grand final got off to a cracking start for Richmond. From the beginning, it was clear that up forward, Richmond's Skinny Jack Titus would be able to get away from Jack Hoston, while South Melbourne's record-breaking full forward, Bob Pratt, was being squeezed and contained by a coordinated approach from the Tigers' full-back line. The Sun published a great photo of Pratt trying to mark the ball, being guarded by 3 players. They just had him covered all day. I'll put it on the grandfinalhistory.au website if you want to see how Richmond blanketed the Swans champion. Richmond got away to an early break, leading 4 goals 3 to 1 goal 1. But then came South's best part of the game, with 3 goals before quarter time, leaving Richmond ahead by just 1 point. South supporters must have been feeling relieved. After an early scare, things were moving back to normal, and now they would take control of the game from here. But it was not to be. The second quarter started off as a tightly fought affair, Goals to Titus for Richmond and then Pratt's first for the game brought the scores level. But, as reported in The Age, from then on, Richmond applied the acid test, and South wilted. The quality players in yellow and black began to shape the game. Veteran Alan Geddes took control on the wing and continuously sent the ball forward, where Jack Titus was sure to collect, and, if not Titus, then small man Ray Martin would crumb or get into position for the mark. At half-time, Richmond were in a threatening position, 10 goals 8 to South Melbourne on 6 goals 5. But South Melbourne had put on so many big scores during the season, those stunning quarters where goals seemed to rain down. Surely they could get themselves back into the game. During half-time, spectators were entertained by old and new technology. Overhead, an autogyro flew, taking pictures for the Sun newspaper, while on the ground, an Indigenous man climbed the fence and showed how a boomerang could also fly around the ground. The interest of the crowd seemed to be evenly divided between the modern and ancient innovations on display. In the third quarter, goals did rain down, but for the Tigers and not the Swans. Richmond had pace, accurate passing and great marking, while South appeared flat-footed and confused. They knew they could play better than this, and yet Richmond just would not allow it. The only time Richmond's run was halted was when a spectator marked the ball after a Tom O'Halloran goal and refused to return it. A new ball was provided, and the play continued in the same style. The only moment for the Swan supporters was the lone run by Wilbur Harris, who went on a 60-yard dash to score a consolation goal. The game was over, even with a quarter to play. Richmond 16 goals 11 to South Melbourne 6 goals 11. The last quarter was notable, but not for good play. Several footballs were souvenired, perhaps by South supporters looking for something to relieve the disappointment of the game. Bob Pratt scored his second goal to reach 150 at an average of 7 goals per game, and Richmond supporters could only manage jeers. Perhaps they were angered by the undisguised violence being meted out by some frustrated South Melbourne players. Swans vice-captain Peter Revel had resolved that this would be his last game, and he decided to go out swinging. He king-hit Richmond's Bert Taylor, broke Kevin O'Neill's nose, and spent much of the quarter diving into packs knee or elbow first. It wasn't one-way traffic. At one point, Martin Bolger had Revel on the ground, holding him by the throat. The boundary umpire told him, "Play fair," which, by that point, might have been what Bolger thought he was doing. Laurie Nash did have a bit of a go in the last quarter, kicking 4 goals in an effort that would give him 6 for the day, and some level of respectability for South Melbourne. But the crowd were leaving the ground, and the final scores told the story of Richmond's dominant performance. In the club's 50th year, they had their Jubilee Centenary Premiership. 19 goals 14, 128, to South Melbourne, 12 goals, 17, 89. The Richmond rooms were full of supporters and officials and players celebrating the win. South Melbourne President Archie Cross conceded Richmond were the better team on the day, along with the usual speeches of congratulations. The post-game tour in the Sharrowbank cars went through the city with cries of, "What do we do? Eat 'em alive!" bellowed out by Tiger players every few minutes. At the club dinner, the Premiership cake was cut by Mr. James Charles. The 83-year-old was the club's first secretary, helping to found the Richmond Club 50 years earlier, and now able to celebrate the team's 4th premiership. Celebrations were not just limited to local supporters. At the dinner, a telegram was received by one supporter who listened to the game on the radio in Scotland. The cable read in part, "The broadcast was perfect. Please convey my congratulations to my Birthtown club." The tradition of supporters tuning into grand final broadcasts from all parts of the world had started and continues today, even if the technology has changed. It had been a remarkable era for the Tigers, perhaps underrated with the passage of time. Between 1927 and 1934, the club had been in 7 grand finals. While they'd only won 2, running into Collingwood at the peak of the machine's power did not help. But it was undeniably a good time to be a Richmond supporter. After dinner, it was time for more touring in the extended cars, or Charabancs as they were known at the time. And, in payback for 1933, the Tigers toured South Melbourne, serenading the locals with more "Eat 'em alive" calls, which were not appreciated by the locals, before a much warmer reception in Richmond at the Town Hall, cinemas and more. The cavalcade ended up in Park Orchards, where the dancing went on until daylight. South Melbourne's change room after the game had turned nasty. Pratt and Peter Revel confronted the teammates with allegations of bribery. There were heated arguments and a punch-up. Apparently, the fights against Richmond in the fourth quarter were not enough. Several in the press condemned the violence yet again on display, embarrassingly in front of special VIP Centenary guests, who were not given the best advertisement for the national game, but rather brawls and punches. The Herald called on the league to introduce an order-off rule, as other codes had, but we know that would not happen. The tribunal was in action a couple of weeks after the game. Richmond's Kevin O'Neill was suspended for 4 weeks for striking Revel. A charge against Jack Baggett for striking was dismissed. Peter Revel, despite his defence of being struck on the head and not knowing what he had done, was suspended for the entire 1935 season. It was reported that he had retired, but he did try to return for the 1936 season, but South Melbourne knocked him back. So he went and played a season for Coburg in the VFA, winning the best and fairest for the competition, before joining Fitzroy for 2 seasons, which included a best on ground against South. In an interview many years later, he said of the grand final fourth quarter fights, "I took 'em all on." While Richmond and South enjoyed the benefits of finishing at the top of the table, North Melbourne and Hawthorn had spent most seasons since crossing over from the VFA in 1925 at the bottom of the ladder, North having yet another winless season. Both clubs had loans from the VFL approved after the season in an attempt to deal with cash flow challenges and help them get their clubs in order. While the worst of the depression might have passed, the uneven results of 1934 showed that the clubs further down the ladder would struggle to get players and regain their competitiveness. North Melbourne would have a better season the next time the league celebrated a Centenary Premiership, but that is a way off yet. North's retiring president called for more frequent audits to ensure the Coulter law regarding limits to player payments was being observed. He said the only clubs not breaking the Coulter law were the ones who could not afford to. There would be many more seasons before the eventual successor to the Coulter law, the salary cap, was properly enforced. We'll leave the first Centenary Premiership there. The league would have its centenary in 1996. Richmond had their Centenary Premiership in their Jubilee year. The players got special Centenary medallions from the Melbourne City Council. But now the focus was turning to season 1935. Discussions on possible new fixtures were being presented. New coaches were being appointed, and new hopes were being entertained by 12 teams and their supporters for better results. So join me next time to see how 1935 unfolds. If you've enjoyed Grand Final history, leave a review wherever you get your podcast from. The more goals we kick, the easier it is for others to find the podcast. If you have questions or want to leave feedback, please email me at info@grandfinalhistory.au or check out the grandfinalhistory.au website or Facebook and Twitter for more Grand Final history.